Start this the way I planned. We have with us Stephanie Doyle, who serves as the National Outreach and Partnership Coordinator in the DC office of CCL. Much of her work involves building relationships and engaging with other organizations and NGOs to coordinate efforts on carbon pricing and climate policies at the federal and state level. Her outreach work also involves enhancing CCL chapters' abilities to partner and coordinate locally with other environmental, particularly those that are left of center, business and NGO groups. So welcome, Stephanie. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
First question, let's get the biggie out of the way. Is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act compatible with the Green New Deal or a first step towards the Green New Deal? In other words, can people supporting the Green New Deal also support the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act?
Yes, of course. Most people that I've spoken to that are supportive of the Green New Deal agree that a carbon price will be somewhere in the final work that comes out from a Green New Deal. As far as I understand it, from the organizers of Sunrise and AOC, they just don't want a carbon tax to be the part that people focus on, but rather the outcomes. So the jobs, the 100% clean energy, all the things that the bill is for. And that's because it's really, as of right now, meant to be more of an organizing vehicle and an outline rather than the actual legislation. So by leaving out and not focusing on the carbon tax, which has tended to be a more controversial part of the policy, and focusing on the goals, it makes it a really easy organizing tool for both 2020 candidates and just in general organizing environmental groups.
Well, before I go to the next question, you mentioned the Sunrise Movement. For those who don't know, that was the group that sat in on Nancy Pelosi's office and has been, I think, the primary mover of, along with Alexandra, in partner with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, of the most prominent movement on the Green New Deal. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say Sunrise and Sierra Club are the two that are pushing it the most, and Sunrise works very closely with Sierra Club. Their offices are in the Sierra Club offices, so they're
I didn't know that.
Tightly linked together.
We were in the Sierra Club office, but I didn't know Sunrise was right there.
Yes.
Yeah, they may have gotten their own space now, but when they were getting going, they were in the Sierra Club office. So,
to what extent do progressive organizations you work with in DC who've endorsed the Green New Deal support or oppose the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act?
Yeah, so nobody that I work with opposes the act. Many of them have issue with the regulatory rollback portion, but I have yet to meet a group, at least in DC and among the major climate groups that I work with, that oppose it outright. So there's obviously a few on the far left who oppose any market mechanism, like Friends of the Earth or Food and Water Watch, but they honestly aren't really ever going to be for a policy that involves market mechanisms or capitalism. And they don't really have much of a Hill presence. So we just don't really work with them. We have an open line of communication with them, and we've talked to their leadership, but for the most part, it's been kind of agree to disagree. We both are clearly working in different frameworks. And so, but we do have an ongoing line of communication to the few orgs that have come out against it.
Okay.
But yeah, mostly it's groups are supportive or have issue with certain aspects of it.
Okay. How do you respond to someone who says that the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, unlike the Green New Deal, moves things along too slowly or fails to provide programs for climate justice?
Yeah, so I think this one might surprise a few people. I agree with them. And I think that's a really important thing to be able to say, to admit that fee and dividend isn't enough. It's not going to ever be enough as the Green New Deal, because the Green New Deal takes on every aspect of climate change, which a carbon fee really isn't able to do. nor does it address the specific concerns of environmental justice advocates. But the bill and what CCL kind of stands for is to attract the widest group of people, and especially the widest group of members of Congress of both sides of the aisle to a policy. And really, CCL, we exist for our principles, which are we want to take a huge chunk out of emissions. We want to protect low income and middle class people from rising energy costs. And we want it to be bipartisan. And when I speak to groups who say, this isn't enough, I say, of course it isn't. We believe that the carbon price is the best first step. And that CCL actively acknowledges that, especially when it comes to sectors that a carbon price doesn't really get to, like agriculture or transportation, we're definitely going to need other bills, amendments, and that we recognize that there's going to be ongoing policies needed to address the climate crisis holistically. And I think it's also important to remember when you're having these conversations, that CCL would not be opposed to a bill that had additions for environmental justice or that had other things in it. It would just need to be and continue to be bipartisan, because we really do believe that's the only way to get a lasting policy. And another thing that I was thinking about when I was thinking about this question was that I would also acknowledge, I think, especially to groups that work in environmental justice at CCL, we haven't really been good at that in the past. And we're just now really getting a good action team around environmental justice, and that the additions and kind of the policies that would need to be done correctly need to be written with frontline communities. And I think that process is something that CCL is just sort of, we want to be involved in, but that we acknowledge that it can't just be us writing something in to sort of check a box. So yeah, that is how I address that question.
That is wonderful to hear from me.
Me too.
How would you work with a local progressive organization, for example, a 350 chapter, a Black Lives Matter group, a group fighting current anti-immigration policies?
Yeah, so I would encourage people to show up and not talk about CCL, and especially don't talk about fee and dividends. So it sounds counterintuitive, but really, when you show up somewhere and you're a good ally and a partner and you say you're from CCL, people for the most part, if it's an environmental group, they know who CCL is. They know kind of what we're for. And if they don't, they can go home and kind of look it up on their own. But really what matters is showing up, showing that we're not transactional, that we're not there to just get an endorsement. We're there for the relationship. And really, the same way with our members of Congress, we wouldn't expect them to change their mind or endorse something on the first go. We really need to remember that we want to build up a relationship and show that we're willing to be there for other groups as we want them to be there for us. And I think for some groups that are really progressive like that, just showing up to talk about us it's not going to work. So showing up, being a good ally, participating in things that speak to you, even just as a citizen. You don't even have to show up as CCL. But once you get to know people and you're like, oh, I'm also involved in this other group, people get curious, and but they also trust you and trust your values. And so I think that will be the best way to interact with groups like that.
Okay, I have one more prepared question, and then we'll move to you, David and Rochelle. Which are the local progressive groups you'd most recommend reaching out to?
Yeah, so this to me is really dependent on your district. So at the end of the day, we want to move members of Congress. That's what CCL exists for. And so I really leave it to our volunteers to find out from your member of Congress who they want to hear from. And if they tell you that they want to hear from your local environmental justice group, then that's who you should be focusing on. And this is going to vary by district. Obviously, if you're in a blue district, the groups you're going to be working with are a lot more progressive. Not to say you can't work with groups on either side of the spectrum, and you should. But when you're talking about kind of prioritizing, I think thinking through who is it that my member of Congress really needs to hear from in support of this, that's who you should be thinking about and focusing on.
Okay, I'm going to let you, David, and Rochelle alternate questions until you run out, and then I may add a
Rapid
few.
fire.
So, David, you go ahead and go first.
Well, I have a lot of questions. My first one, I was really interested in your last response. We have in our county a group that has been around twice as long as CCL, and they're a locally focused group. It's called the Center for Climate Protection. And they actually have paid staff. And the one thing they did do is get community choice power, green power, started in Sonoma County and use that as a model to go throughout the state. So they're an effective group. They're very serious. And they now have done this community power thing, and they're looking forward to what their next local thing is. And I've been asked to join in their strategic planning committee. And I was kind of honored because they're a very respected group, and they knew I was CCL when they invited me in.
Yeah, that's great.
And I sit in these meetings once a month, and we talk about local and state initiatives, and I never sing the praises of CCL. They know who I am, and you know, if I speak up and say price carbon, they say, yeah, we know, Dave.
Yeah.
But I'm establishing a rapport with them, so I'm really happy to hear that your message is the same as what my thing was, to take off my CCL hat and establish relationship.
Yep, that's awesome.
Okay.
And I do think that really, you know, like I said, a lot of people now know who CCL is, and so just by showing up, we can kind of give a good impression without necessarily having to kind of hammer home our policy, which for a long time we did have to do that because nobody knew who CCL was. But that's really not the case anymore. So I've been slowly trying to get this message out that we can, you know, we can reach out to other groups without necessarily making it this, we just want to come and present and get an endorsement and then we're going to leave, because that isn't really going to work. And when you think about it, getting an endorsement is great, but what you really want is a group to trust you, to come with you to an office, to continually talk about this from their perspective, because at the end of the day, the member needs to hear from lots of different groups that think this is a good policy. And yeah, and so I think that's a really good way to go about it. It does sound counterintuitive at first, but.
Yeah.
Rochelle?
Hi, okay. So I actually emailed you earlier today, Stephanie. Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I'm the one who wanted new slides.
Oh, yes. I wrote to our, a few of our interns to see if they had time to work on that too.
Oh, thanks. I also got in touch with Dave Kane, who
Oh, great.
apparently can help with that. So we're running into, I'm in the Hudson Valley of New York State, and we're running into some progressive people who feel that they can't support a bill like this because it doesn't, what should happen is the money should be kept by the government as a tax instead of a fee and used to create green energy and make it affordable for everybody.
Yep.
And so first of all, you know, I think they're sort of missing that if you don't give people the dividend, then you're hurting low-income people because they won't have a way to pay for the costs that are going to be passed on to them. So I understand that that's something to be emphasized. But also, just I understand what the idea is of the market, that if you make something more expensive, people are going to want alternatives, and that's why the fee making fossil fuel more expensive is going to create research and development and innovation in green energy. But I'm wondering if we have anything more specific. I guess the REMI, maybe parts of the REMI study that really has shown that is what will happen. You know what I mean? They don't need the government to create these green energy and make them affordable because the market will do that. And this is how, you know. I
would ask Rick Knight. He may have some good examples. The other thing I would say that you can sort of say, and this again is sort of a more when you're in a more nuanced discussion, but that, you know, at the end of the day, we don't know if a bill is going to be 100% revenue neutral. There may be, you know, some of it that stays with the government goes back to reinvesting, which is, I know, what a lot of groups like Sierra Club would like to see. Really, like I was saying before, what CCL is wedded to is making sure that the low income and the middle class is protected. And there's different models that show you can do that with like 60% of the dividend. But the reason that we stick with 100% is because we are really going for that sweet spot of attracting Republicans and Democrats. But that being said, we wouldn't be opposed if that was what ended up coming out.
Right.
But I do think
we want it to be bipartisan. We want it to actually have a chance of passing.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Exactly.
think that's another big thing.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times I find that explaining our theory of change also helps when you're talking to groups, because right now you have a lot of groups arguing for a lot of different solutions, and that's okay because we need groups putting pressure on different aspects of our political system right now. And that having somebody who's making the argument for why we need reinvestment and we're making the argument for why 100% dividend makes sense, that doesn't mean we have to be necessarily opposed to each other. I know that doesn't help when you're trying to move somebody to help move your member of Congress, but it's just important to kind of keep in the back of our minds that in the moment that we're in right now, it's okay that there's a lot of different ways this can go kind of on the table.
Right. I agree with that. And, creating the relationships is very important. And, and just admitting that, listen, if I had it my way, that's the way it might be. But I feel like we don't have the luxury of, we're probably not going to have all, a overwhelming Republican Senate in 2020. And, and we want this to last. So we need to do what we can do. It's too urgent.
And I do think saying that, in my ideal world, it would probably look, that's okay to say. Most people can have these kind of nuanced conversations. It just sort of, sometimes it takes hearing from a CCL staff person that's okay to have those is I have them all the time.
Thanks for the permission.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have another one, David?
Well, yeah, I have 1,000 things jumped into my mind. One really quickly, when talking to people who would rather see the money go to some sort of government programs, I've often raised the question about the onerous regressivity of a carbon tax, and it just kind of goes by them. Oh yeah, and what else? They don't get it somehow that if you have a substantial carbon tax, it's going to be horribly regressive. So anyway, do you have trouble getting that point across, Stephanie?
It sort of depends on the group. I think with sophisticated groups like Sierra Club, who obviously know this policy inside and out, they have economists and lawyers. They see it as a kind of backup in case the price signal doesn't work. So they kind of harbor some lingering worry that a price alone isn't enough, and that if you're not going to do a cap, the best way to kind of make sure that this is doubling up on what it should be doing is reinvesting some of the money. So I do think some of it goes back to just a mistrust of a price being able to do what it's supposed to do. But I don't know if I ever run into it where they don't understand the regressivity part.
Okay. Well, then the price thing, I just have a real quick kind of follow-up on that. One thing I've been using in presentations and just talking to people is the letter that was published in the Wall Street Journal in January by 45 leading economists, 27 Nobel laureates, and the who's who of economic policy. And they pretty much spelled out the bill, I guess, HR 763, almost completely. They said it has to be a carbon tax. It starts low. It has to increase substantially every year. It has to be revenue neutral. It has to have a border adjustment sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the point I raise is this is not climate scientists. These are not environmentalists. These are economists. And there's two things that they see. One is there is an economic threat posed by climate change. And two, knowing economic mechanisms as they do, they find this approach in HR 763 to be the best bet we have. Does that work? Do you think that's a good argument?
Yeah, again, I think it sort of depends on who you're talking to. To some people, economists are the man, and they're, that's going to win them over. For people who trust government and trust economists and trust academics, then yes, I do think it depends on the group. And we're increasingly running into that, where the groups that are really far, far left, they don't want to work in the system. They want to, kind of blow up the system, which is, that's a fair one. The system has been kind of messed up, but yeah, so that argument does work, I would say, for the majority. And especially when you're talking to just like a greater public progressive audience, I think that generally people trust experts.
Yeah.
But
a quick follow-up on that, a comment on that. I do also find I have a couple of slides that show not just how many families are helped or hurt, but how much, on average, the lowest, one of them has the lowest quintile versus the highest quintile, another one the lowest decile versus a whole graph. And that really shows the lowest decile. It's something like, it depends on your assumptions, but 173% higher dividend than their actual cost would be, which means they get to walk away with a lot of extra money. And that has been very useful for me to show people. And all it's based on is the carbon footprint. That's all that matters.
I think too with that, Bob, is being able to also show that the really high quintiles lose a little bit, like that they don't lose a ton, but that also hits at that sort of fairness thing that people are really concerned, like, why should everybody get the same amount? And if you can show, yes, everybody gets the same amount, but the richest people are going to be losing a little bit because they just have a huge carbon footprint. I find that tends to help in some conversations too.
Rachel, do you have another question?
No, I don't. I actually just wanted to say that another thing that I think might be helpful to bring out is something I was watching a CCL webinar today, and I can't remember the name of the presenter, but he said that, and I thought it was just a great line, that the other thing the dividend does is it's going to make it such a popular policy that no one's going to let the government get rid of it. Once people start to get a check every month, they want to keep getting it, and it's going to get bigger every year. Unless, so that's like built-in political will right there. I mean, it's like a beautiful thing, really. So I think to say that is, to people who think, oh, this will never pass, people won't want it, it will be very popular once people realize they're getting a check every month.
Yeah, and luckily, I think something that's hopefully going to help us in the long term is that Canada just started this exact program in some provinces, and I'm really hoping that some data starts coming back from there that we'll be able to really use, because it's really hard to talk about something in the abstract when you don't have really good examples to point to where it's worked. And I think that too is kind of the mistrust of carbon taxes, is that they've been really low in the places they've been tried. And so hopefully the Canada example will be one that we can point to.
Stacy, I see you just joined us, even though she may have already said it. If you have a burning question you want to ask her and she repeats herself, that's fine.
Happy to repeat myself.
So if you could unmute yourself if you have a question. If you don't, just keep listening.
Thank you.
Cool.
No question. Okay. So I want to be clear. I was afraid that CCL couldn't say it supported climate justice provisions in fear of alienating the conservatives, the Republicans. And from what I'm hearing you say is that we can indeed say that CCL supports additional things that work on issues important to indigenous communities, frontline communities, minorities, and so forth. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the way that I would think about it is, well, first of all, as groups, you're free to work on you know, whatever lights you up. And if that's something locally that your group wants to work on, yes. When it comes to the bill, the way I think about it is those three principles that I laid out, that's what we really care about. If a bill is bipartisan and it has those and it has other things like that in it, we're not going to oppose that. I would say that we do have to be super careful depending on where you are, that we aren't, you know, going to a Republican member of Congress and necessarily saying that. But I think when you're having conversations with groups, saying that we don't oppose it and we're not going to, you know, we never say we don't think you should put that in a bill, but that we see our role as kind of being the middle ground where we're trying to bring people together. And that, yeah, so like we've had other groups who've gone to members of Congress saying, we'd like to see you add something to this bill. And we didn't fight that. We really are leaving it up to sort of the members of Congress to figure out what's going to kind of come out. But yes, I think if that's going to help your conversations with the group and making that clear that we aren't opposed to anything like that, then yes, that's totally fine. I would be careful about putting it in writing in an LTE, just because that then gets tossed around to a Republican and blown out of proportion. But yes.
I too have many more questions, but does someone else have a question they would like to ask her?
Yeah, I have a kind of a broad question, which is kind of my main thrust for coming to this meeting.
Yeah.
Is I'm in Northern California. Our chapter spans 2 congressional districts, and both of them, one is a sort of a centrist, moderate, good guy, and there's another guy who is viewed as very progressive and very environmentally strong. And although he speaks glowingly about bold climate action, when pressed about 763, he sort of said, well, I don't know. He doesn't feel like he wants to endorse it. And okay, I'm going to go riff on this a little. My sense is that the Democratic leadership is telling their members to back off on this, soft pedal it, don't. There's a political cost to endorsing this bill. I've kind of noticed, I just did a quick check and I looked at the people who are on that new select committee on the climate crisis, the committee that has very little teeth. Mm-hmm. And those people are exactly not the people who endorsed our bill. There's no crossover. So my sense is that we have some real work to do in the Democratic leadership in getting this reticence out of the way and actually getting a real sense of being free to endorse this bill.
Yeah, so I would kind of take a different take. From what I understand, the Democratic leadership is kind of like waiting to figure out what comes out of the House. So like Pelosi's been sort of dismissive of the Green New Deal. She let the select committee go forth, but didn't let it really have any power. And really the reason I would think that most of the people on the select committee haven't endorsed something like this is because the point of the select committee is to think through all the options. And if you endorse one option, that sort of looks bad. Mm-hmm. It's the same reason that a lot of the chairmen of the committees don't like picking specific policies until they've sort of worked it through the hearings. So that would be one thing I would say. I also think that, again, there's sort of an acknowledgement that this is the middle of the road policy that can attract Republicans. Like it's bipartisan. And so in some cases, having your Democratic leadership touting that is not ideal. Like Pelosi coming out in support of this bill right now would be kind of the kiss of death because no Republican would touch it. So, and she knows that. Like I would imagine that she recognizes that whatever she endorses is going to just immediately be toxic to being bipartisan. So I think in some ways the leadership thinks far more strategically long-term than just sign whatever comes in front of them. And that's why I think she's also been kind of middle of the roadish about the Green New Deal. She's letting her caucus kind of figure it out without trying to dictate the direction it should go. That being said, we at the DC legislative level are really focused on getting people on the committees of jurisdiction, so Energy and Commerce, Ways and Means, and Foreign Affairs, to sign on to the bill. And that's what a lot of those members that have signed on, that's where they come from. They sit on those committees, because that's sort of what allows your bill to move, is if you have people that know the bill and agree with it in the committees that it has to go through.
Just quick on that. One of our congressmen is a sort of centrist guy, and he's on Ways and Means. And one of our chapter keeps talking about, we really have to start having conversations with him. Do you think that's important?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you're Ways and Means, it's a very powerful committee, and especially since Dems now control it, that's really important.
Okay. We'll work on it.
But yeah, so again, it's sort of like, yes, there's benefits to having every single Democrat support this, but there's also the flip side of that doesn't leave a lot of room for Republicans. So it's sort of a weird strategic play at the moment that we want a lot of Dems, but we want to be strategic about those that sign on. That doesn't mean you should stop reaching out to anybody, because eventually you need everybody on board. But especially when it comes to leadership, they're going to be a lot less committal than some of the other members of Congress can be.
Just one quick follow-up question on that. The public perception that I sometimes run into is we get the Climate Leadership Council, and these old moderate Republicans are the only ones who have spoken out about this policy explicitly across the political spectrum. And sometimes that's a problem. Do you agree that we have to kind of work around that sometimes?
I don't, only because there's so many Democrats that have submitted very similar bills.
Okay.
And there's a slide in one of the old presentations I've given that has a list of every Democrat that's ever submitted a carbon pricing bill. Not all of them are 100% dividend, but quite a few are, and I can send that to Bob after, and he can send it out. But
okay, yeah, I know that. I think I just try to balance that in my head.
Yeah, and balancing it with that lots of progressive people support carbon price too, and I think you can sort of talk about a carbon price and then say, and the most progressive version of that is with a dividend, and that's backed up by academic science. So,
Rochelle or Rachel, did you have another question?
Yeah, I just wondered if you could tell us, Stephanie, how it's going with Democrats. Are we getting more?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, with Republicans.
Oh, yeah. We're still working on the Republicans. There's a lot, I think, of talk of Republicans that want to submit different versions, like more conservative looking bills. There's probably going to be another, the Curbelo, the Market Choice Act, that will probably get resubmitted by a Republican. So, but yes, we are still actively working on getting more on our bill. I would expect within the next few months, we're hoping.
Okay. And how about the Senate bill? Is that going to be reintroduced soon? Do we know?
Yeah, that one we're also hoping to get hopefully by June, but that's sort of a stretch, so we'll see. But
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
I see that a DC has joined us. If you wish to watch this video, we are recording it, and there'll be a link on the Progressive Outreach forum. But if you have a question for Stephanie, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it. Are you there, DC? I see you're muting and unmuting. Let's see. I wonder if I can unmute you. Okay. I don't see how, so we'll just go proceed. Now, one of my concerns is with the Green New Deal, such a lightning rod attack by Republicans, and the fervent desire of especially younger Green New Deal advocates that it's the litmus test for good Democrats. Does that create some problems for CCL, and how do you navigate that difficult dual challenge?
Yeah, I think the Green New Deal is definitely going to be a big part of the election. But I think the fact that it's sort of undefined leaves room for members to kind of talk about it how they want still, which was the purpose of leaving it sort of undefined for now. They don't want to pigeonhole people, I don't think, right before an election. So I think what we'll see is members submitting bills that would achieve the goals in the Green New Deal, both the ones running for president and just regular members of Congress. And to me, that's how we should frame our bill when you're talking to progressive audiences, that it could be one tool in the toolbox to achieve a lot of those goals. It is definitely a tricky line to walk when you're talking about Republicans and a more public way of talking about that. We don't want to pit them against each other. We don't want to be like, look at this socialist plan, you should like this carbon tax instead. I don't want to do that just because it sets up a bad dynamic. That being said, I do think it's going to spook some Republicans towards carbon pricing just because they're going to get spooked that this is the alternative, that's the alternative. But I think we need to be really nuanced when we talk about it, that a carbon price can be a tool on its own. It can be a tool as part of the Green New Deal. It's a tool. It's not this be-all, end-all solution to climate, and we're going to need extra policies regardless. But that it is a way to achieve really big emissions reductions in a bipartisan way.
Stephanie, I have a real quick question on framing. One that I've been using, I've gotten some traction with, is to put it in the narrative of time, is the Green New Deal is a forward-looking thing, but it's going to require years to finally build this whole thing out into what it could become. And I will tell people that's great, because we need a very broad view of what we need in the future. But right now, we can stop the bleeding, basically. We can act this session of Congress, pass this bill, and start on the road towards solving climate. Is that a narrative that you think we should use?
Yeah, I definitely use that. I will say there's sort of a ongoing debate amongst climate people, whether we get, it's sort of phrased as like one bite of the apple legislatively, or we get multiple. Like we're going to have one flashpoint moment where we can pass something like a Waxman-Markey again, or a Green New Deal, or it's going to be a series of slow bills that build up. Mm-hmm. And I tend to think it's going to be more of the latter, and that, you know, this could be one piece of something. But yeah, I do think generally that argument works, that this is something that the Green New Deal still needs a lot of fleshing out. It's going to be, you know, probably a bunch of bills over a few years, and that this could be one you can work on now.
Yeah, a comment in support of that. The Sierra Club did a webinar on what is the Green New Deal last week by the director of the Living Economy program campaign. And they said that the Green New Deal is a suite of ideas, and not all of them, you know, even looking at the resolution that was passed, that does include just about everything. He was talking as if that not all of that will actually end up as legislation. Not every congressman will support all of that. So he doesn't see any inconsistency. He didn't sound like there was any inconsistency between supporting the Green New Deal that covered everything and the final product won't necessarily cover everything.
Yeah, I think the way to think of it is like the Green New Deal is the goal, the like where you want to go, and the rest of it will be sort of filling in how you get there, and that's what's going to sort of play out over time. But that you can be supportive of both. You can support all those aspirations and goals while also working to pass the tools that are going to get you there.
Okay, other questions?
Those are really good ones. So I've been
Okay, another thing I think I actually wrote you. Remember that there are a lot of progressive Democrats who are not members of these progressive organizations, but who work hard to get the Democrats elected, who the Democratic congressman will listen to, and they form lots of clubs. And this is a source of people who understand bipartisan, they understand we trying to get something actually passed as opposed to making a grand statement. And so that could be a very fruitful group to look at to influence the Democrats. And one of the things I'm doing here is to hammer that it is not either the energy innovation bill or Green Deal, but the energy innovation could end up being a part of the Green Deal or some other conservative solution to climate change. And that is one of the messages I'm trying to hammer home in terms of defining the message here in Austin.
Yeah, I think that's really smart.
Another comment, I know it's your thing, Ebony, but there are organizations like the Sierra Club where the National Executive Committee sets the policy that every Sierra Club in the country must follow once they pass. But then there's organizations like 350.org where every 350 chapter is completely independent. They are not bound by anything the leaders of 350.org said. And among 350 chapters, you will find some who will fully endorse this bill and others who will never endorse this bill. And so looking at those kinds of issues is also something that can be helpful in working with groups.
Now, we found in the, I'm a good friend of the leader of 350 Bay Area, and she finally had to, she's a CCLer, and finally she just found that she couldn't run her organization and discuss this because there was so much acrimony about market-based solutions, yay or nay.
Yeah, and I do think there's groups where that is more of the discussion. And again, you sort of have to prioritize who's worth spending time with and on, and who's going to move your member, and what the odds are of actually changing their minds. Because there are going to be groups whose minds we don't change, and that's totally okay.
Right.
Hi, this is Debbie. So sorry, my internet cut out earlier right as you invited me to speak. I wrote in the comments about attending a sunrise watch party last week, and I would say for especially the people who will never sign on, I attended not to promote CCL, but just to be like present and be a resource. If they have questions in the future, they can ask an actual person, and to move at the speed of trust, like we say.
Yeah,
so building that relationship for future.
That's awesome, Debbie. Yeah, and we have a good relationship with Sunrise. I know their founder, and Jamie, who does our state policy, knows a lot of their people, and so we have a very open line of communication. And the way I sort of describe it is we're moving kind of in parallel, and they're very good not to try to bash carbon pricing. You can sort of see how they're careful about how they word things. But yeah, I think that's great. Is just building up trust within these groups by showing up and in solidarity is really what's going to move.
That's wonderful to hear, because the strongest advocates of the Green New Deal here in Austin are strongly anti-market right now, and so it's nice to hear the Sunrise Movement is not.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely people within it that aren't, and I think some of it too is people, again, they would ideally like to change the entire system, but they also acknowledge that can't happen on the timeline of solving climate change. So I think there is a bit of push and pull even within that organization, as there is in CCL too. I mean, it's
one other question. I have had the letter signed by 626 organizations that I think was written by Friends of the Earth, come up by several people, including in the Sierra Club, as to isn't the Green New Deal opposed to market mechanisms? Go ahead and address that issue, because many of us will have to address that issue.
Yes.
Yeah, so that letter was not signed by Sierra Club or any big group except for 350 and Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. And really the way that I read it was they left room for a fee and dividend in there. I know people read it differently. But the way I read it was that they'd be open to a carbon price if it was equitable and really, really like a very, very, very progressive version of that, which I don't know if ours would count, but to me, it left space for that by not, it called out everything but a carbon tax, really. And then again, that group was also not super thrilled with the Green New Deal resolution that came out. They wanted it to be far stricter. So again, there's spectrums across the board. I think we have to really pay attention to who members of Congress are listening to, because at the end of the day, that is who we need, who's going to move them. And I also think that reaching out to just because those groups sign that doesn't necessarily mean they're against it, because I know that there are groups on there that are supportive of our policy. So I would sort of just take it with a grain of salt. It came out before the big Green New Deal resolution. I think a lot of groups do believe every word in that, but I also would guess that there are groups who don't necessarily agree with every word in that. But yeah, and again, that really the big major groups nobody signed that. So just to sort of take that as it is. And
Yes.
yeah. And the biggest reason that we couldn't sign on to it was that it was technology. It wasn't technology agnostic. They said that it basically had to be wind and solar only, which we don't believe that we don't ever want to pick what technology comes out. So that was the biggest thing to me that stopped us from signing on.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Stephanie? Well, thank you very much. This has been really helpful.
My pleasure.
Official CCL position was not as friendly towards climate justice and other issues important to progressives, and so this will be very helpful in moving forward.